Okay, and we have started recording. Great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming and for joining us. This is the virtual panel of the Edith Wharton Society that is taking place as part of the American Literature Association's annual conference. We are recording and having this panel take place virtually, and then it's going to be uploaded to the conference platform so that attendees at the conference can access it. And then if they want to, of course, they can get in touch with the presenters to ask them more questions and hopefully expand the conversation that way. For our purposes today, we have 4 presenters, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we will have 15 minutes at the end of the panel presentations for discussion with the audience members too. So thank you so much, audience members, for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here, especially on a hot and sweltering Saturday afternoon. At least it is if you're on the Eastern Seaboard like I am. So thank you. My name is Sheila Wyoming. I'm Associate Professor at Champlain College and a member of the Edith Wharton Society. And I also serve the Edith Wharton Society in the capacity of membership coordinator. And I'm happy to be chairing this panel today. And we are going to be talking about Edith Wharton in times of difficulty and crisis here. And we have a couple of really interesting topics lined up that fit nicely into that discussion. So I'm going to introduce all of our presenters right off the bat, and then we will proceed in order of the way that they are listed for us. So first we are going to have Mindy Buchanan-King. Mindy is pursuing her PhD in US literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, along with a graduate certificate in literature, medicine, and culture. Mindy received her BA from Emory and Henry College and her MA from the College of Charleston. Her master's thesis focused on Edith Wharton's use of romanticism in conceptualizing the artistic self in Hudson River bracketed. Her graduate research is currently focused on representations and interpretations of the body in visual arts, including medical photography of World War I. So Mindy will be starting us off today. And then next we have Chunfang Yi. Chunfang is Associate Professor from the School of Foreign Studies at Northwestern Polytechnical University in China. She's also a PhD graduate in English Language and Literature from Nanjing University in China, and has been a visiting scholar studying literary psychoanalysis and women's literature at Pembroke Center at Brown University. Her research interest is in modern literature, and her book titled Affect, Repetition, and Exile, Self-Transcendence in Edith Wharton's Later Works, which is based on her doctoral dissertation, is to be published in October 2021. Congratulations, Chunfang, that's really exciting. And at present, she is working on a project studying the Chinese writer Jia Pinghua's novelistic techniques. Third in the program, we have Arielle Zibrak. Arielle is Associate Professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wyoming. She is the editor of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, New Centenary Essays from Bloomsbury in 2019, a wonderful collection that I know we're all really excited to be celebrating and talking about upcoming in the Edith Wharton Review. And the author of Avidly Reads Guilty Pleasures, which is forthcoming in 2021, right? Or is it out already, Arielle?
Came out this month.
Yay, yay. Okay, so that's out already. I'm really looking forward to that one. I've been hearing snippets of it all along the way and can't wait to read that book. So that's going to be great. And she is also currently working on a monograph about women writers and the American arts and crafts and new thought movements. And then last up in our program today, fourth, we have Maria-Novella Mercuri. Maria-Novella is a teaching lecturer in comparative literature and European cultural studies at University College London, where she completed an MA in philosophy and a PhD on Edith Wharton and German culture. Prior to this, she completed an MPhil in Anglo-American literature at the University of Florence, Italy, with a dissertation on Wharton's The Fruit of the Tree, later published as a monograph in Italian. She has published 2 volumes of translation into Italian of Wharton's Italian short stories and is now translating The Fruit of the Tree. That's really cool and very exciting. So thank you, everyone. We will proceed in that order, starting up with Mindy Buchanan-King, whose paper is entitled Interpreting Architecture as a Site of Precarity in Edith Wharton's Hudson River bracketed.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Mic sound good? Okay, perfect. In the interest of time, I'm going to dive right in. As Sheila said, my title is Interpreting Architecture as a Site of Precarity in Edith Wharton's Hudson River bracketed. In 1927, Lauren Palmer, an editor of the magazine The Delineator, penned a letter to Rutger Jewett, editor at D. Appleton and Company. The letter was meant to enjoin Jewett in persuading one of his most renowned clients, Edith Wharton, to abandon the title she meant to give her newest novel. According to Palmer, Jewett should send word suggesting to Mrs. Wharton that the title in question is perhaps unfortunate, I believe any title to be unfortunate that requires explanation. Wharton, in turn, expressed her own intentions regarding the title. Her response, I want it made clear to the editors who accept my book for serial publication that I must have my own way with regard to titles, as well as to all the details of my tales. Wharton, perhaps not surprising at all, had her own way, and her novel was serialized 1 year later in Palmer's The Delineator under the title of Hudson River Bracketed. Hudson is ostensibly Wharton's consular roman of writer Vance Weston, following his travails as a writer from his naive beginnings in Euphoria, Illinois, to his myriad disheartening encounters with the publishing industry in New York City. Unfortunately, Hudson is also a work that, until recently, has been overlooked in Wharton's oeuvre. It is within the past decade that Wharton scholars have, thankfully, endeavored to make the case for Hudson as a novel of value. Judith P. Saunders, Meg Toth, and Elizabeth Ammons, for example, have each been essential in foregrounding reconsideration of Hudson as a novel that speaks to Wharton's complex relationships with myriad issues, including romanticism, modernism, and feminism. These critical understandings of Hudson largely treat Vance Weston as its focal point, yet Wharton did not name her novel after Vance or even allude to Vance's profession of writing in the title. Suggestively, Hudson River Bracketed is not a literary, but rather an architectural term. Hudson's scholarship, however, largely tends to offhandedly dismiss the title, leaning instead into misleading explanations that began as soon as its original publication. In a 1929 New York Times review, for example, Percy Hutcheson gave this explanation of Wharton's title. A writer on landscape gardening in America, writes Hutcheson, had placed in brackets a style he designated as Hudson River. This, however, does not appear to be true. In research that I've conducted to date, the writer on landscape gardening to whom Hutcheson refers, Alexander Jackson Downing, or A.J. Downing, whose work I will discuss shortly, never once wrote of Hudson River in brackets. Hutcheson's explanation appears to be one of the earliest examples of what is now versioned into a tradition, an obfuscation of Wharton's naming of her novel. I argue, though, that by illuminating the origins of Wharton's title, we may find the author using such term to create a space in which she can undermine a persistent alignment of her work to the notion of tradition. In effect, Hudson River Bracketed emphasizes the precarity and limitations of tradition. That any architectural element would find its way into Wharton's work is, of course, not surprising. Her first published work in co-authorship with Ogden Codman Jr. was The Decoration of Houses. As most of us know, decoration became a sort of interior design handbook during the late 19th century that eschewed Victorian era principles of overcrowded and overstuffed design. Wharton's travel writings, such as in Morocco, A Motor Flight Through France, and Italian backgrounds, provide musings upon more classical architectural elements, where she explores what Blake Nevius dubs the aesthetic spectra of Europe. There's also Wharton's Italian villas and their gardens, which became what Wharton in her 1934 backward glance calls a working manual for architectural students. And architecture itself is a metaphor Wharton uses for her writing process. In the writing of fiction, she avers that the art of fiction is that slowly built up monument in which every stone has its particular weight and thrust to carry, and in which the foundations must be laid with a view to the proportions of the highest tower. To create a novel, as the writing of fiction suggests, is to architect it. Certainly any number of her canonical works and short stories, The House of Mirth, Mrs. Mancy's View, the list could go on, could be singled out and studied in terms of its architectural elements. But architecture for Wharton always signifies something more than just how a building or an edifice looks. It signifies the very social and moral order, as Penelope Vita Finzi calls it, of life. If architecture is of such importance to Wharton, though, how have critics continually neglected to make a closer examination of the origins and significance of the title Hudson River Bracketed? For unfortunately, most of what is written about Hudson continues to erroneously explain the title, as did Percy Hutcheson in his 1929 review. Such work generally relies upon taking at face value Wharton's Hudson epigraph and in-text definition of the Hudson River bracketed style as that of A.J. Downing's creation. Wharton's epigraph to her 1929 novel reads, A.J. Downing, the American landscape architect, in his book on landscape gardening, published in 1842, divides the architectural styles into the Grecian, Chinese, Gothic, the Tuscan or Italian villa style, and the Hudson River bracketed. This historical background is reiterated in the novel's plot itself, in which Halo Spear acquaints Vance with the history of her ancestral home of the Willows, which serves as the quintessential and fictionalized model of the Hudson River bracketed architectural style. The A.J. Downing, to whom Wharton refers in Hudson, was a landscape architect who wrote several manuscripts in the 1840s and 50s about the principles and aesthetics of landscape gardening, particularly as such design may be applied to American landscapes. One such work was published in 1841, titled Landscape Gardening. However, as scholars like Arielle Horner and Janet Beer note, Wharton's in-text references to Downing cite 1842 as the year of publication for landscape gardening. Yet in 1842, Downing wrote cottage residences. Moreover, in Wharton's original manuscript of Hudson, the epigraph varies from the published version, with Thomas Downing, given as the author, in 1845 listed as the year of the publication of landscape gardening. Such discrepancy of where and when the term Hudson River bracketed appears in Downing's work, and even discrepancies in Downing's name, matter little in the end. That is because, as Horner and Beer write, Downing never actually used the phrase in his work. And indeed, he did not. Instead, the terms that do appear in Downing's treatises are either bracketed mode or bracketed style. Hudson River Valley architectural enthusiast Thomas E. Rinaldi and Robert J. Yasensak affirm this terminology, writing that it is the bracketed mode that eventually worked its way into the architectural vernacular, not the term Hudson River bracketed. If Downing did not conceive of the term Hudson River bracketed, who did? To answer this, we may return to Rinaldi and Yasensak, who write in their work, Hudson Valley Ruins, that Edith Wharton crystallized, if not coined, the term Hudson River bracketed. Buried at the end of a 2008 interview with Rinaldi and Yasensak in the Daily Mail, a bolder proclamation is made. Edith Wharton invented the name Hudson River bracketed, admittedly teasing out the origins of what appear to be similar architectural terms may seem like splitting hairs. After all, bracketed mode, Hudson River bracketed, both roughly convey a style of house that could be intuited as having ornamental bracketed features. This feels much too reductive though, considering the implications of architecture in Wharton's work as an element suggesting more than what appears on the surface. Architecture can convey a deep moral underpinning. Thus, it seems we do Wharton a disservice if we continue to take the term Hudson River bracketed for granted and erroneously dismiss it as a term created by a landscape architect. It is, by all accounts, a term that Wharton herself created. And if Wharton did invent the term Hudson River bracketed, it must signify something, for Wharton was adamant about naming her 1929 novel by such term, and we know she is not a writer known for carelessly selecting terms. In Wharton's manuscript, Hudson River bracketed manifests itself through the fictionalized estate of the Willows. Exploration in previous Hudson scholarship has endeavored to address the question of what Hudson River bracketed means by glossing the Willows as a representation of the past. Arielle Horner and Janet Beer describe the Willows as standing for continuity with the past and a particular kind of integrity. The Willows is thus often conceived of as a sentinel to tradition, an old house, as is described in Hudson, standing in contrast to the rapid progress of modernity. This understanding of what Hudson River bracketed conveys, however, runs the risk of suggesting that as a signifier of the past, the Willows may align Wharton to a perceived enthusiasm for tradition. However, I believe a closer analysis of the Willows and the term Hudson River bracketed reveals another case to be made, an interpretation of Wharton and her work. The author is acknowledging the limitations of tradition through focus on an architectural space that occupies a precarious position, indicative of not the stateliness and elegance of tradition, but of its fragility. For the Willows as a house of tradition and of the past is not pristine or well-maintained. The Willows is instead being actively consumed. It is a house caving in, much like that of the house imaged by one of Wharton's favorite authors. It stands in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. where Poe's narrator encounters the Pennimus house, his eyes falling upon the vacant eye-like windows. I wish I could adopt a Vincent Price kind of voice for this narration, but I can't, sorry. But Poe writes, his narrator's eyes fall upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few ranked sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, his encountering of its mystery reflected in a sorrowful impression. So too does Wharton's Hudson protagonist, Vance, encounter an eerily similar architectural apparition in the form of the Hudson River bracketed home, the Willows. Wharton writes of the Willows, "It is an arcaded veranda ran across this front and all about it, and reaching out above it from bracket to bracket, from balcony to balcony, a wisteria with huge distorted branches, like rheumatic arms, lifted itself to the eaves, festooning as it mounted every projecting point with long lilac fringes. To bear so old a climber on its front, the house must be still older, and its age, its mystery, its reserve laid a weight on Vance's heart. In Wharton's vision, the Willow seems on the precipice of falling, of destruction, as the wisteria with huge distorted branches grows, pushing its way up and up against the house. Nature is prodigal here, the long lilac fringes grasping and clawing at the eaves of the Willows. It is as if the Willows is being slowly pulled down to its collapse, to its ruin. And the space of the Willow seems to whisper of its precarious nature. It is an illusory space, one full of the air of fantasy, as Wharton describes it. It is, in essence, not exactly a solid edifice. Entering the Hudson River bracketed house, crossing its magic threshold as Vance considers it, cleaves one from reality. It is in the Willows that Vance becomes nearly monomaniacal about the past, and his first initiation into this bracketed space becomes absorbed, almost lost in the words of Coleridge's Kubla Khan. In his second encounter with the Willows, as he writes his first major novel entitled Instead, the Willows and all contained within that space, Coleridge, its deceased inhabitant of Eleanor Lorbourne, so absorb him that it becomes the very subject of his novel. The Willows as the sanctum of the past and tradition seems to run the risk of entrapping, of bracketing Vance within its own interiority. There is a danger Wharton seems to recognize through this Hudson River bracketed style house, becoming too captivated with the past and living in it, and in trying to capture its very essence. One becomes too limited, too bracketed themselves, and tying oneself only to the past and to tradition. Perhaps that is why no one resides in the Willows. While scholars typically write of the Willows as a respite for Vance and, by extension, for Wharton, few fail to note that the Willows is truly unoccupied. Once the abode of a recluse, Eleanor Lorbourne, her death saw the home pass to a cousin, who thereafter doled it out to myriad individuals to keep tidy, including Halo and her family. These individuals flit in and out of the Willows, never residing there for any length of time. If the Willows is the site of tradition, then it certainly rings hollow. It is empty. It pulses not with life and gaiety, but instead often echoes in its vacantness, an ancient and decaying edifice. In selecting the term Hudson River bracketed, Wharton thus appears to be claiming a space in which to write not about a Downing labeled style or a mode, which suggests rather an ornamentation, a superficial design element, but about a deeply felt struggle in the limits of bracketing oneself within the margin of tradition. Such term emphasizes not only the continued significance of architecture to Wharton, it underscores her awareness of and engagement with modernity and the risks of being traditional. After all, Wharton referred to Hudson as her ultra-modern novel. In Hudson River bracketed then, Wharton seems to interrogate her status as a traditional writer, the grand dame of old New York. This ultra-modern novel, published in 1929, existed in a modern era during which new writers such as James Joyce and Fitzgerald were crying, "Down with Henry James, down with Edith Wharton." Yet by titling one of her last works by a term she invented, whether consciously or otherwise, in which such term may be emphasized, the precarity of edifices of tradition, Wharton seems to be defying her status as a writer bound to tradition only, and as a writer thoroughly unaware of or scoffing at the modern era. Through the term Hudson River bracketed, Wharton is putting down before the reader the limits to such an enclosed and exclusive house of the past and abode of tradition, where in the end, her protagonist can only grow as a writer if he recognizes and engages not exclusively with tradition, but with modernity, no matter the ills or the gains to be had by doing so. By extension, I believe we may begin to understand through Hudson Wharton as a dynamic author, even in her final years, opening herself up beyond the label of tradition to engage with modernity, pushing beyond and outside of those brackets so often placed around her, to recognize the risks in occupying for too long the space of tradition, for it is much too precarious a space to inhabit. It is much too limiting, and Wharton is much too multifaceted of an artist to be contained and enclosed within such a restrictive space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mindy. That was fantastic. And I really like the novel Hudson River Bracketed. So I love to see people treating it seriously and giving it great attention. Our next presenter was supposed to be Chun Feng, but I don't believe Chun Feng is actually here with us. And so that would mean that we would be moving to Arielle next. I had an email from Chun Feng about how she had been struggling to get the time conversion and had gotten it wrong. So what I am able to do, if she is able to record her paper at a later point in time, I can actually stitch it onto and add it to this recording. So Chun Feng's recording will just be last in the lineup instead of first. So I'm sorry about that inconvenience, guys, but I guess we will go next to Arielle if Arielle is feeling ready instead. Sorry, Arielle, for that curveball.
Oh, that's fine, and thank you so much for doing all of that work to stitch it together if that's how it has to be, and for organizing.
I think it'll be okay. I think it'll be fun.
You've been awesome about rolling with the punches here, so thank you so much. And thank you all so much for being here. Okay, so my talk is called Edith Wharton and White Male Outsiderism. To read The Age of Innocence is to spend a lot of time in Newland Archer's mind. The story is told in the third person by a narrator who, in the beginning of the novel, seems rather distant from Newland, treating us to the rye barbs Wharton is famous for at his expense. But as Sherry Goldberg, who's here with us today, and Lee Clark Mitchell, who is not, have observed, those barbs begin to dry up as the novel progresses, and the narrative distance between us, the readers, and Newland, the novel's protagonist, winnows to a thread. As Goldberg writes, whereas the narrator of the early chapters had triangulated between the reader and Newland, now the narration has, as it were, stretched itself out into a kind of bridge, lending the reader into the operations of Newland's mind. But what kind of mind is it? Careful readers have long noted that Newland can be rather thick, easily manipulated as he is by his older female relatives and even his new bride, May, whom he initially perceives to be the one under his thumb. Carol Singley describes how Archer fails to live up to the ideas of American individualism, writing that, quote, life seems to happen to him rather than the reverse. So what does it mean for us as readers to inhabit the psychological reality of a somewhat passive, wishy-washy member of the decaying New York elite? To immerse ourselves in the patterns of thought that define his worldview. For Singley, Ralph Waldo Emerson is the key figure for understanding how Newland thinks. A romantic transcendentalist with a belief in leveraging one's masculine strength for the good of the nation, Emerson's views are also aligned with Teddy Roosevelt's, Wharton's close friend, who is the sitting president at the novel's close, and the great man Newland befriends, who tells him, quote, you're the kind of man the country wants, Archer. If the stable's ever going to be cleaned out, men like you have got to lend a hand in the cleaning. Newland's association of his own worth with his proximity to Roosevelt is akin to that notorious bastion of such white male privileged attitudes, the lawyer narrator of Herman Melville's 1853 Bartleby the Scrivener, who asserts, I do not speak it in vanity, but simply record the fact that I was not unemployed in my profession by the last John Jacob Astor, a name which I admit I love to repeat, for it hath a rounded and orbicular sound to it, and rings like unto bullion. I will freely add that I was not insensible to the late John Jacob Astor's good opinion. Melville's lawyer is a satirical character designed to point out how, as Ijeoma Olu has described in far greater historical and sociological detail in her 2020 work, Mediocre, quote, by making whiteness and maleness their own reward, we disincentivize white men from working to earn their privileged status. If you are constantly assumed to be great just for being white and male, why would you struggle to make a real contribution? Why take a risk or make a determined effort that might fail when you can be rewarded for keeping your head down? Social incentives are for such men toward mediocrity. While Singley argues that Newland is a failed Emersonian individualist, lacking the personal force that men like Emerson and Roosevelt championed. I'd like to suggest that he succeeds in fully inhabiting a less commented upon strain of Emersonian thought that holds the superiority of a very certain kind of white man to be self-evident. In lectures and essays with titles like The Genius of the Anglo-Saxon Race, Traits and the Genius of the Anglo-Saxon Race, and the Anglo-American, as well as in his book, English Traits, Emerson repeatedly argued that Saxons, a group of people he identified as having Teutonic and Norse heritage, were physically and intellectually superior, not only to people who we would identify as of color today, but also to those who in his own time period would be identified as belonging to a middle or 19th century, or as 19th century pseudoscientific terminology had it, yellow race. Jews, Asians, mixed race people, Italians, Spaniards, and Turks, among others. Furthermore, as Nell Irwin Painter writes in her History of White People, for Emerson, alongside the Saxons, all other races were lesser, gendered, and by default female. This last bit is especially important because it tips us off to how, in the bizarre economics of this worldview, racial identities perceived to be lesser were also aligned with the lesser gender. White manhood for Emerson, Roosevelt, and I would argue Newland, is a compound term with each part contingent upon the other. Once we understand the contingency of whiteness and manhood for Newland, his attitude towards Ellen, the woman with whom he considers having a sexual affair, becomes much clearer. Her character is both a powerful version of the feminine, with which he must contend, and a receptacle for these other yellow races. Not only on account of her repeatedly mentioned dusky complexion and tightly curled hair, but also through the way objects associated with the yellow races cohere around her. Newland sends Ellen yellow roses instead of the white lilies of the valley he sends to his fiancée and then wife May. Ellen is described in childhood as a gypsy foundling who possessed outlandish arts such as dancing a Spanish shawl dance and singing Neapolitan love songs to a guitar. Her drawing room is perfumed with the scent of some far-off bazaar, a smell made up of Turkish coffee and ambergris and dried roses. All of these details amount to an association between Ellen and the exotic, the forbidden, and ultimately the less than. For Newland, she is a corrupting element that will weaken the strength of his Anglo-Saxon manhood. At the end of the novel, when we are told that Archer has become a good citizen, it is clearly implied that to his mind, his goodness is a consequence not only of avoiding adultery, but also of avoiding the race contamination that an affair with Ellen would imply. Ellen is pitted against May, a character who is insistently linked with imagery of whiteness. Her fair hair, pale complexion, and tendency to turn whiter still rather than color at the suggestion of anything indecent. While Newland's decision between Ellen and May as potential partners, which is really not in the end his decision at all, is framed in his mind as one between sexual purity and sexual experience, as Anne McMaster notes, it is a short step from realizing the artificiality of May's sexual innocence to realizing the limitations of whiteness as a point of view. Even as Archer's ultimate self-worth is found in preserving his Saxon superiority, he sees the cracks in this lie beginning to emerge. Because here's the thing that's abundantly clear to most readers of the novel. He wants Ellen. The American diversity that Newland sets himself apart from is precisely that which is lacking in his own experience. He complains early on in the novel to May that we're all as like each other as those dolls cut out of some folded paper. We're like patterns stenciled on a wall. Can't you and I strike out for ourselves, May? What he misses is that he and May are stenciled on a wall they continuously help to keep erected. What a new life it was going to be with this whiteness, radiance, goodness at one side, Newland thinks upon confirming their engagement. But his feelings of suffocation only intensify. Throughout the novel, Newland describes feeling limited, hemmed in, and outside of the experience of real life. He tells his writer friend Ned Winsett that the New York of literary clubs and exotic restaurants, though at first shake made it seem more of a kaleidoscope, turned out in the end to be a smaller box with a more monotonous pattern than the assembled atoms of Fifth Avenue. It seems worthwhile to pause here to note that 3 years prior to the publication of The Age of Innocence, the massive silent protest parade organized by the NAACP to support a federal anti-lynching bill would pass down the same avenue. Clearly with knowledge of this event, not to mention the Chicago race riots of 1919, which were international news, Wharton has Newland compare his own race to a species of Kentucky cavefish, which had ceased to develop eyes because they had no use for them. In one of the novel's more emotionally climactic moments, Newland tells Ellen he sees his own life as so bare and so poor, all these things are a sham or a dream. His failure to achieve a more heterogeneous, diverse, and to his mind, more real experience are not, however, to be chalked up simply to his decision to remain with May rather than Ellen. But his own understanding of the circumstance in that way has much to tell us about how he perceives the causes and cures of his sense of himself as an outsider, when all evidence indicates he could not be more firmly planted in a position of power and privilege. Newland's Emersonian individualism, failed or not, translates to a tendency to view his experience as singular and disconnected from the system of which it is inherently a part. Recent thinking on whiteness in our own time tells us as much, as works like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility argue that white liberalism is largely to blame for systemic inequity. And even DiAngelo herself has been criticized for focusing too heavily on the feelings of alienation or vulnerability white people experience surrounding racism, rather than directly confronting the role they have played in the exclusion of others. This is precisely where we find Newland, lamenting the casting out of Ellen in which he plays a part, claiming to feel outside of a system he himself upholds, swimming blind like a cave fish, while all the while evincing an awareness of his own blindness. Wharton's narrator gives us just enough distance from her protagonist to demonstrate both how Newland's perspective operates and its profound limits. By narrating in the third person rather than the first, Wharton shows how Newland's reality feels predetermined, outside of his own control. But in keeping that third person narration so close to his thoughts, the novel suggests that the very limitations he perceives as outside of himself are in fact his own. Newland's refusal to be accountable to his own circumstances, to paint himself as a victim of them rather than their author, are all symptomatic of the double bind of white supremacy. Of the many things Wharton's remarkably dynamic work teaches us, perhaps chief among them is the way the idea of whiteness functions, and how people like Newland, who believe themselves to benefit from this construct, must also work very hard to distance themselves from its fictions, which damage them, albeit in far less significant ways, alongside those they oppress. Ralph Marvell of the 1913 Custom of the Country, another of Wharton's white male outsiders, is famously fond of describing Washington Square as the reservation, and of prophesying that before long its inhabitants would be exhibited at ethnological shows, pathetically engaged in the exercise of their primitive industries. Meanwhile, Archer repeatedly refers to his powerful New York family as a tribe. Critics like Nancy Bentley and Amy Kaplan have long observed that this language is evidence of Wharton's interest in the emergent field of anthropology. But it's also inextricably tied to a white supremacist myth deeply embedded in the culture of the moment. Olu describes a history that should by now be very familiar to historians and scholars of the period, how the conquest of the indigenous peoples of the American West became an enterprise suffused in the nativist desire to celebrate the supremacy of white masculinity. In Olu's telling of the story of the rise of the entertainer Buffalo Bill Cody, a story in which, of course, our old friend Teddy Roosevelt plays a large part, she points out that Cody's career started with a show in which he reenacted his 1876 scalping of the Cheyenne chief Yellow Hand, who in actuality was a minor warrior, not a chief, named Yellow Hair, name revised, we can only assume, to uphold the image of racial otherness. Cody's story of his own brave scalping exploits became reversed in later iterations of the narrative that had the natives scalping the cowboys and not the other way around. And this was the story that long endured. As Olu writes, while both natives and Europeans used scalping as a weapon in battle, the European use of scalping as one of their many tools of genocide would be largely erased from textbooks. In place of this gruesome history, Americans are widely taught half-truths, glorifying the supposed suffering of European colonizers. What's significant about this terrible history for my purposes here today is the white nativist reversal of the narrative of oppression. We find such reversals throughout Wharton's work, not only in the encroachment on the reservation in the custom of the country and the vanishing tribes of the Age of Innocence, but also, as Elizabeth Ammons argues, Ethan Frome offers a eugenics parable about a white Anglo-Saxon New England disappearing. This is the same story told over in multiple guises, that of the white male outsider colonizing the condition of oppression itself. In the 1929 Hudson River Bracketed, we find yet another reversal within this trope. Vance Weston of Advance, Illinois, is not, like Roosevelt, a New Yorker who lights out for the territories to prove his masculinity by shooting bison with Bill Cody, but the reverse. A Westerner who sets out for New York to prove his mettle by reading in a dead woman's personal library. At home in Illinois, Vance grew up attending old home weeks where grandma figured as the pioneer wife in a log cabin, with grandpa garbed in a cowpuncher's rig, aiming his shotgun through a crack in the shutters, and the children doing Indian war whoops behind the scenes. When he arrives at the Hudson River Valley, Vance immediately sets to reading in Miss Lorburn's library at the Willows, marveling, all these books had been a woman's, had been this Miss Lorburn's, and she had sat among them, lived among them, died reading them, reading the very one on the table at his elbow. It all seemed part of the incomprehensible past to which she and the house belonged, a past so remote, so full of elusive mystery that Vance's first thought was, why wasn't I ever told about the past before? While the past to which Vance refers is the literary history of European men, his sense that the past has been obscured from him and his initial location of this truth in a feminized space suggests a deeper blindness. Throughout the novel, Vance is parodically sexist. As in The Age of Innocence, Wharton uses the proximity of the narration to his own thoughts as a tool for mockery, as when she writes, Vance felt grown up and important. It put him at ease with Laurie's sister to have a secret between men to keep from her. He is also, meanwhile, painted as a literary hack who must be shaped and cultivated by his more knowledgeable and sophisticated female cousin, Halo. Like Newland's, Vance's own existential drama is played out in a false contest between his romantic interest in two different women, the naive and younger Laura Lou and the experienced and older Halo. His literary talent and value are of a piece with the white masculinity he must prove by conquering the New York literary scene. Indeed, because as a writer he is only mediocre, his whiteness and maleness are the defining characteristics of his greatness. This becomes abundantly clear when Vance experiences some success and attention from his short story Unclaimed, a work which, as Meredith Goldsmith describes, appeals not because of a genuine superiority, but because of its deliberate anachronism. Shortly after the publication of Unclaimed, the sculptor Rebecca Stram chooses Vance as a subject for a bust. When he sits for Stram, who is Jewish, she wears a dirty yellow sweater and sits amidst a cloud of smoke. Like Ellen Olenska, she is a yellow other in both race and gender. When the bust is exhibited in the Tomorrowist's exhibition, it is thronged by an eager crowd, a hit. Here we see the aesthetic representation of the white male body, subject to the same scrutiny as Lily Bart's tableau vivant or the native scalps that Buffalo Bill kept on display in the early iterations of his performances. One might even argue that this is Ralph Marvel's vision of a white man exhibited at an ethnological show, realized. Vance is both conscious of his objectification and eager for it. The work of art that celebrates him, unduly, as he himself notes, saying that it shouldn't have been made until after he'd written something really great, is the artistic vision of a non-white woman that he can only come to appreciate through the art criticism of his female guide and critic, Halo. Wharton writes, as he studied through Halo's eyes the rough clay head with tumbled hair and heavy brooding forehead, he began to see that under her surface mannerisms, Rebecca Stram had reached down to his inner self, that the image seemed, as Halo said, to body forth what he was trying to be. But the inner self of Vance is merely the empty external image of power, the white male body recognized as its own marker of success. While I mostly agree with Ammons that Wharton was, quote, a person of her class, race, and time, I do not necessarily agree with her conclusion that Wharton was an ordinary white racist. Instead, I think of her as a kind of extraordinary white racist, which is to say, one to whom the violence associated with the multipartite identity of white masculinity was readily apparent. In her satires of white male outsiders, I see a growing awareness of how both maleness and whiteness cultivate ignorance alongside power. Wharton's depictions of the mediocrity of many white male accomplishments and the way white masculinity depends on women and people of color to disseminate its fictions of greatness suggests a far more complex attitude toward white supremacy, and perhaps most importantly, a way for future readers and students to see the incomprehensible past with a little bit more clarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arielle. I am now seeing the color yellow in a totally different light, so that was wonderful. Thank you. Our third presenter, fourth up in our original program list, is Maria-Novella Mercuri, whose paper is titled, quote, Marriage and Parenthood Between Age of Innocence and Jazz Age, the Plight of the Vulnerable in Wharton's Novels of Old and New New York. So Maria, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks, everyone. So in this talk, I want to contrast the ideas of marriage and parenthood presented in The Age of Innocence with the one Wharton offers in her other novels of the 20s, The Glimpses of the Moon, A Sun at the Front, The Mother's Recompense, Childless Sleep, The Children, Hudson River Bracketed, and The Gods Arrive. These works have in common the fact of having been conceived or started during the First World War, and they all reflect more or less explicitly the somber mood and the upset values of post-war society. Secondly, they are all concerned with the increasing precariousness of the institution of marriage and the consequent vulnerability of the offspring, children and young people who are forced into premature adulthood while their parents enjoy a perpetual mental and moral childishness. In all of these works, the issues of the relationship between parents and children, of the children's education, and of the responsibility of parents towards their children are at the forefront. And this is the case also for A Sun at the Front, mistakenly received by contemporary reviewers as a belated First World War novel, and which is in fact an analysis of parenthood and an exploration of artistic creativity. It is also the case for Hudson River Bracketed, which with its sequel, The Gods Arrive, constitutes a Künstlerroman, Wharton's account of the development of the mind of a literary creative genius. I will devote the first part of this paper to The Age of Innocence and the second to the subsequent works. And in my reading of this group of novels, I will highlight the references to Goethe that show Wharton's devotion to German culture, even in a period in which she was staunchly supporting France. The Age of Innocence, in The Age of Innocence, Wharton throws a backward glance on the old New York of her parents' generation from her new post-war perspective. The title, The Age of Innocence, just like Goethe's title, Wilhelm Meister's Years of Apprenticeship, Lehrjahre, identifies the novel as, in the words of Nicholas Boyle, the story of a phase now over and done with. The reader of Lehrjahre is aware of the emptiness of the life plans Wilhelm is constantly formulating, as well as of the dubious value of his retrospective interpretations of the phases of his life. Like Wilhelm's, Newland Archer's is a story of moral development through illusion. For Wilhelm, it is his theatrical mission. For Newland, his passion for Ellen Olenska. Both protagonists are driven by eros, by desire for a cherished, absent, and unattainable object. Like Wilhelm, Newland is a young man who, after being crossed in love, learns that inner building must coexist with practicality and takes on the social responsibility of a mature and rational human being. In both Lehrjahre and The Age of Innocence, marriage is the symbol of faith in a meaningful future, and simultaneously the means to bring this future about. Despite the outward uneventfulness of the 2 years covered in The Age of Innocence, this period is crucial in the life of Newland because it transforms him into a particular social persona, making him choose among all his possible selves, the one he will be for the rest of his life, and which is ethically the most acceptable in the universe of the novel. From the start, the narrator stresses 2 features of Newland's character. His life is molded on social conventions, which he has come to consider a natural fact, a feature that the narrator repeatedly satirizes. Another important characteristic is that he was at heart a dilettante, and thinking over a pleasure to come often gave him a subtler satisfaction than his realization. And this is a typical trait of a Bildungsroman hero. Wilhelm too prefers fantasy to reality, and dilettantism is in a way a necessary part of every apprenticeship, because it implies experimentation, tentativeness, openness to all possibilities, exploration of one's own potentialities, in search of one's niche. Newland is an aesthete and feels he is the superior of his circle in matters intellectual and artistic. But he would never dream at this stage of taking an independent stance on moral issues. He has chosen his fiancée May because her faultless and Olympian beauty satisfies his aesthetic sense and his masculine vanity, whilst her purity and total ignorance of life will give him ample opportunity to give free rein to his pedagogic instinct and Pygmalion-like attitude. She has been molded to be an adoring and submissive wife and the custodian of old New York values of decorum, sobriety, propriety, honesty, fidelity, and allegiance to the tribal code. That May is so completely representative of old New York is to Newland, at first, one of her major attractions. Nothing about his betrothed pleased him more than her resolute determination to carry to its utmost limit that ritual of ignoring the unpleasant in which they had both been brought up. Newland's feelings for May, his perception of her personality and his expectations are immediately clear in the episode of the performance of Gounod's Faust in chapter 1, but it is also clear that Newland's idea of May's personality is preconceived and reductive. She shows herself to have an intuitive understanding of Newland's secret motive to advance the wedding. And she manages to articulate her fear that Newland is in haste because he's not sure of continuing to care for her. She also senses that there must be another woman, although she mistakes her identity. And by offering to release him from his engagement so that they don't build their happiness on a wrong done to somebody else, gives the same reason that Ellen will give Newland for not wanting to become his mistress. May shows herself to possess both the old-fashioned old New York fairness and nobility and an unsuspected awareness of sexual matters. You mustn't think that a girl knows as little as her parents imagine. She appears to Newland during this talk, the first open one they have had, grown in womanly stature and dignity, but she remains all the more inscrutable to him for this show of feelings and thoughts he would never have credited her with. Until the very end of the novel, when he has his talk with his son Dallas, he will never understand how strong May's perspicacity and empathy were. Due to the novel being constructed on an extremely rigorous focalization, the careless reader also risks underestimating May, because we view both her and Ellen, who also remains a largely unfocused and mysterious character, exclusively from Newland's point of view. But, like Wilhelm's, Newland's judgment is often hopelessly mistaken. At two different points in the novel, he proposes elopement to May and to Ellen, and each of them, being at core, as Cynthia Griffin-Wolf says, uncompromising realists, gently reject this proposal because they know that there is no place where it is possible to live a life of perfect happiness, untrammeled by social restraints. Newland never realizes that the two women are working together to ensure that his sentimentalism doesn't wreck both his life and theirs. In chapter 25, he says to Ellen, "I'm of your making much more than you ever were of mine. I'm the man who married one woman because another told him to. You gave me my first glimpse of real life. And at the same time, you asked me to go on with a sham one." What he calls sham life is his marriage to May, who is carrying their child. And something that May tells Ellen before telling him. By compelling Newland to stick to his duty as a husband and a father-to-be, May and Ellen allow him to continue his moral and social development. It is thanks to both of them that Newland, when we find him in his library after a 30-year ellipsis, can look back to the life he has lived as a decent, useful, and productive one. and the oppressive family tribe that appears to him in chapter 33 as imprisoning him and relentlessly bent on separating him from Ellen, has in fact the same function in his life as the Society of the Tower in Willem's life. The Society of the Tower is always at work behind the scenes to prevent Willem from ruining his life with his various plans, built on a succession of delusions that he must save German theater, that he's a great actor, that he's Hamlet, that he's in love with this or that woman, etc. Now I turn to the novels of New York. In all the subsequent novels of this decade, Wharton confronts the reality of a Western world profoundly changed by two factors: the new social role of women and the trauma of the First World War. The first feminist wave had concluded with remarkable achievements in the field of women's rights, sanctioned by the conquest of the franchise in Britain in 2019, in 1919, and in the passing of the 19th Amendment in the US in 1920. Women's breaking free from many constraints had obviously profoundly affected society. In the novels of the Roaring Twenties, we often find the figure of the flapper, the frivolous, superficial, and utterly disengaged woman, frantically busy in pursuing her own interests and pleasures, and convinced that she has freed herself from any social bond. Several appear in Wharton's late novels. Lila Gates in The Mother's Recompense, Lida Wyant in Twilight Sleep, and all the women in The Children except Rose Sellers. They all have in common, apart from affluence and social status, a shallowness of feeling that makes them completely indifferent to legal and emotional ties, hence the facility with which they alternate marriage and divorce and their cruel neglect of their children. The emancipation of this type of woman is, however, for Wharton, only a delusion, because even her sexual freedom is merely one of the characteristics men now require of their new feminine ideal. Thus, this women's behavior is still ruled by male expectations. In addition to this social upheaval, the First World War has left anxiety, instability, and a flawed peace treaty that sets the scene for a new catastrophe that in Europe appears increasingly inevitable. Wharton had been able to observe this much changed post-war society, not only from the point of view of an American expatriate in France, but also as a visitor in New York, where she returned in 1922 and 1929. The first of Wharton's novels of the Jazz Age is The Glimpses of the Moon, and its view of marriage is in sharp contrast with that of the preceding work. Susie and Nick Lansing see marriage as a provisional partnership based on the checks they are sure to receive as presents from the rich friends on whom they habitually scrounge, and the offer of beautiful houses to spend their honeymoon in. They will divorce when one or both of them manage to find a rich new spouse. The pair thus intended to put into practice the idea of fixed-term marriage propounded by the Count in Goethe's novel, The Elective Affinities. His opinion of the institution of marriage is that it is only its fixed eternal duration amid so much change that has something inappropriate about it. Any marriage ought to be contracted only for 5 years. In fact, Nick and Susie managed to remain together only 2 months before going their opposite ways after an argument about boxes of cigars that Susie is trying to smuggle in their luggage for Nick's future enjoyment. Wharton in this novel is constantly jeering at her characters, as shown by another direct allusion to Goethe's novel, when Nelson Vanderlyn, who has just arrived in Paris to get his divorce, says to Susie, "Tell you what, great thing, this liberty. Live and let live, eh, Susie? Haven't we all got a right to our affinities? Ain't you got an affinity, my dear?" At this point in the novel, when she has been separated from Nick for 6 months, we're supposed to believe that Susie has undergone a profound transformation that will prevent her from accepting another very advantageous marriage proposal. She has realized that she loves Nick, and her dormant maternal instinct has been awoken by the experience of looking after a group of children on behalf of their parents. Being a foster mother for a while has inspired in Susie a desire to belong and a sense of responsibility that enable her to make renunciation for the sake of someone else. Her second honeymoon with Nick, after they have predictably been reunited, therefore includes also the 5 former children, their pets, and their governess. Although the plot is absurd, the upshot is that parenthood can inspire and mature even to moral lightweights as Susie and Nick. Another evidence of their growth is their feelings during their separate and solitary walks in Paris towards the end of the novel, in which they seem to show for the first time an awareness of their surroundings, the somber atmosphere in a country that has only recently come out of a terrible war. The references to the war are more numerous and explicit in The Mother's Recompense, set in 1919. The war has separated Kate Cleffon from her lover, Chris Fenner, who volunteered in the French army. She meets him again in New York after 3 years, finding him aged, altered, and matured by the experience, and engaged to her daughter, Anne. According to Lee, we are to interpret the recompense of the title as atonement. Kate's silence about her ex-lover would be self-sacrifice, and the final payment of her debt towards her daughter, whom she had abandoned as an infant, and who nevertheless sincerely loves her. The word renunciation recurs in Kate's thoughts. But in my view, Wharton is suggesting the Goethean idea of self-renunciation as the only way of avoiding self-destruction. Kate's obsession with Chris is a form of misapplied eros that she barely controls, and until the last moment, she almost hopes that Chris will not turn up at the altar. In Twilight Sleep, the sense of personal devastation and loss experienced by the generation who had endured the conflict had become a general desire to ignore sorrow and evil, as Pauline Mountford says, and a determination to avoid responsibility. This, however, lays a heavy existential burden on the shoulders of the new generation, their children. As suggested by the epigraph in this novel, which is the dialogue between Faust and Care, die Sorge, taken from Faust 2 in Act 5. Nothing can keep away worry and anxiety. Young Nona Mountford in Twilight Sleep struggles to keep some semblance of unity in her family, while her father is completely absorbed in his affair with his irresponsible daughter-in-law, and her unaware mother divides her time between committee work and the pursuit of physical rejuvenation. Nora feels more and more as one of the trench watchers who, during the Great War, were executed for falling asleep on their watch. Ironically, she will be shot by mistake because of Lida and her father's liaison. She's a sacrificial victim, an Iphigenia, and she too takes her place among Wharton's renunciants when she refuses to help the man she loves to get a divorce. But she finds out, after all, that renunciation, instead of bringing spiritual freedom, means a closer self-imprisonment. Like Nona, 13-year-old Judith Wheeler in The Children must bear a heavy burden and mother the little band of step-siblings, the result of various intricate marriages and remarriages, who group around her, and so are never to separate, no matter what divorces their parents may be plotting for the future. In chapter 28, she appears surrounded by her siblings and cutting bread and butter in complete unawareness of her immortal model, who is obviously Lotte in Berta. There is renunciation in this novel too, by the 46-year-old Martin Boyne, who has fallen hopelessly in love with Judith. The sense of desolation that the whole episode has left in him is well expressed in the lines of Faust he murmurs to himself before leaving for South America. Hudson River, Bracted, and the Gods Arrive constitute a Künstler roman that mirrors Goethe's masterpiece, even in its two-part format. At the end of the 2 years covered in Hudson River, Bracted, Vance Weston seems to have reached very important goals: a mastery of his craft and a belief in his creative power, a published and successful novel, a stable relationship with a woman who is his intellectual equal and his superior in education, and thanks to her, even some financial independence that will allow him to tackle his next book with some peace of mind. Why then did Wharton feel the need several years after the publication of Hudson River bracted to write a sequel to it in The Gods Arrive? One wonders whether she was not following, even in these, the Wilhelm Meister example. At the end of Lehrjahre, Wilhelm too has achieved important goals. Natalie, his fiancée, a child, Felix, friends, a place in society, some degree of self-awareness and knowledge of the world. His apprenticeship is over, and yet the journey must continue because the Society of the Tower lays on him the task to learn by experience through some years of travel. In the same way, at the beginning of The Gods Arrive, we find Vance Weston completely convinced that his apprentice days were over, and embarked with Halo on a steamer heading for Europe. At the end of the second volume, yet a new self has emerged. Vance's comprehension of the culture of the past has given him the sense of where he comes from, and his yet unborn child is giving him a future. His personal descent to the mothers, another Faust reference, has brought forth acceptance of continuity and of parenthood, and commitment to art and to life. As with Wilhelm in Wanderjahre, the climax in Wharton's Künstlerroman comes not with Vance's sexual successes, but with his acceptance of the responsibility of paternity. So to conclude, family was the foundation of old New York, whose entire life unfolded in the respect of traditional values. Individual happiness could be sacrificed to the interests of the group, and only the manifest approbation of the clan ensured social integration for the individual. Social rules were rigid and nearly ritualistic. The unpleasant was excluded with particular care. Human relationships of any kind knew little open communication. But with all its faults, old New York succeeded at least in protecting, with the institution of family, its weakest members, the children. Newland Archer grows into maturity by renouncing his love for a woman with whom he shares a deep affinity, and by embracing his duties as husband, father, and citizen. By contrast, in the novels of ultra-modern New York life, Wharton shows the conflicting ideas of marriage held by members of the same generation, comparing serious-minded young women like Anne Cleven and Nona Mansford with shallow and immoral flappers like Lila Gates and Lida Wyand. In a world that has banned self-sacrifice, fears pain, and pursues coarse pleasures, the children pay the price of the lack of stability and nurturing that characterizes modern families. At the same time, the commitment to the new generation can give stability and meaning to the life of individuals, and this remains as true in The Glimpses of the Moon and The Gods Arrive as it was in The Age of Innocence. How have I done for time?
Thank you very much. You did it just perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We do have a little over 10 minutes left for question and answer. So I'm very glad for the audience members who are able to attend and speak with us today. And if you are interested in asking a question, I would ask you to either raise your hand using the little reaction emoji that allows you to raise your hand, or you can physically raise your hand in the camera and I'll be happy to call on you either way, whichever works best for you. So. Melanie has a question. Please go ahead, Melanie. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Unmute.
There we go. My question was for Arielle. And it's about some of the background that you probably know a lot more about than I do, which is about men in Boston and sort of Bostonian attitudes toward things like immigration. I'm thinking a little bit about somebody like Howells, for example, and how he portrays Boston as so much more conservative than New York, and like A Hazard New Fortunes and other things. And I wondered if you had any sense of Wharton's attitude toward Boston via the Wharton family, or other contextual information about Boston and its particular sort of white male identity from the time of Wharton's life. So that's kind of a complicated background question, but I thought you might know a lot about that or be interested in it.
I'm very interested in it. And I want to just actually ask a clarifying question too, which is like, why in particular are you thinking about Boston in reference to this? Because of Emerson, or?
There's Emerson, but there's also the Teddy Wharton family is a Bostonian family as opposed to a New York family. And I wondered if you had a sense that Wharton drew a kind of line around Boston and saw it as more parochial. I'm remembering some things from the biography which seem to suggest that she saw it as a little backward, as a little less open in a way than New York. And I just wondered if that was of interest to you or if you'd thought about it.
I think that's so interesting. And this is relatively new work for me. So that's definitely, I really appreciate the question because that's definitely something for me to pursue. I do think that she saw Boston as being more backward. And I actually think that Wharton appreciated the heterogeneity of New York maybe more so than her characters do. And I think that's where we can see her satire functioning. So I think that, like, especially in the Age of Innocence, where I see Newland kind of being unaware of the fact that he himself is longing for diversity, like that diversity would actually improve his experience and his life. But he doesn't, it's like something's missing, but he doesn't know what it is. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that like, I have any evidence to suggest that Wharton herself was necessarily actively longing for diversity, but I think that she appreciated a lot of artists and architects and writers from various different backgrounds in such a way that I think that, I think the like parochialness and backwardness of Boston for her would definitely also have a kind of overlap in terms of, because there's this sense that like culture to her, it does include those yellow races in a way. So even though we hear a lot about her anti-Semitism, which is definitely very real, she also, loved Proust, and she had Jewish friends. And I think that she's so interested in culture, clearly Italian culture is very interesting to her, which would be included in that category of yellow races, that along the lines of what a diversity of culture brings to us, I think that she has that kind of a level of awareness that these white male outsider protagonists themselves definitely lack. So that's, I think, where we see the disconnect between the attitudes presented by the characters in the novel and attitudes that Wharton may have herself held. But again, I'm really, really grateful because I will think more about that. I think that's a really good lead.
Myrto has a question. Go ahead, Myrto.
Hi. First of all, thank you everyone for your really inspiring papers. It was really good to see you all, first of all. I have a question for Mindy, and thanks for talking so much about Hudson River Bracketed. And it's also a novel that I've more recently started to think more about, especially about the architecture in the novel and the willows. Working on an essay recently, and there are also some parts where Willows is compared to the Parthenon in Greece. And I was wondering, I really liked your reading of how the Willows, how Wharton kind of criticizes being bracketed by tradition through the Willows. So I wonder if, this kind of tradition is a kind of inherently European one for her. And perhaps this kind of like modernity that she's thinking about is also like necessarily American for her. So if she's actually making some comment about that too.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I've thought, and unfortunately I had to cut for time some of the thoughts about the Willows, because I think the word itself doesn't necessarily convey a bracketed space. It's more natural. So I think it's interesting because I ran across actually in A.J. Downing's landscape gardening, he writes prolifically about willows as a landscape element. And I think reading Hudson River bracketed and getting more into the architectural elements of it, I think obviously Wharton does bring the European, her sense of her travels in Europe, of her habitation in Europe, longer than in the US. I think there's a little bit of a conflict in the willows. I get the sense of, on the one hand, the elements, and I think Dr. Lemming kind of points to this in her book of what a library means to woman, that the brackets, that the house itself, this Hudson River bracketed, however we want to describe the term, is not necessarily a style that Wharton likes. It's something that's irregular, and it's not something that I've read in other interviews with Wharton, that it was not necessarily, this bracketed space was not necessarily a type she liked. So even in its traditional manner, even that she's kind of butting up against in the description. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer your question, because I think it's a really interesting space, the way she crafts it, because it is, even in Downing's description of these bracketed spaces, not, he never says the term Hudson River bracketed, but in the bracketed mode and the bracketed style, it's always described as very American in style. It's never described as European. It's supposed to be integrated into an American landscape. So I think it's this conflicting kind of space that she's created in Hudson River bracketed. And I think that's why it's such a rich book. Even the term itself, there's so much I think she packs into that. So I think it's definitely something worth thinking about, this conflict between the European and the American kind of styles that she's playing with.
Do we have another question? Feel free to raise your hand virtually or really. Maria-Novella has a question. Feel free, go ahead. Just make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, this is again about Hudson River bracketed, and it's to Mindy as well, because I was a bit surprised by her identification of the willows in terms that were sort of negative, as something falling down and old, decrepit, etc., a ruin, etc. Because it seems to me that the importance of the willows in the novel is relative, and it is relative to Vance. Vance comes from the West, where nothing is built to stay, to last, at least in the way Wharton saw it, and where people do not have private libraries, they do not accumulate books, they do not pass them on to the next generation, etc. So for him, this is why for him it's the beginning of something completely new. It's the Parthenon, it's the past, etc. Yes, the way Wharton presented the whole thing is satirical, because Vance is obviously very limited, but the willows is an important starting point for him. Then he will go to Europe and he will meet the real past and real art, etc., etc. But then when he comes back to the States, he goes back to the willows, and to the willows he finds Halo, and Halo is pregnant with their child. So it's the willows is a very important in his, even within those limitations. It's very rich of meaning, very full of Vance's life, his life with Laura Lou, etc., etc. It's a very good symbol, a very good summary of a lot of motif in the novels. So it is something that grows and develops together with Vance, as well as starting his development, rather than being something falling. And so I don't know. Sorry, it wasn't a question.
Mindy, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I certainly see that point. I think it's, obviously a very valid point. And, I agree. When I was working on my master's thesis, the importance of the willows. And I think that comes through in that I'm still working with this idea and still playing with that, what the willows represents. And I think there is a growth there, just like for Wharton. The past offers a potential for growth. I mean, returning to old New York in the Age of Innocence, she gets a Pulitzer Prize for that. But I also think her reaction to that, to writing about the past and getting those kind of accolades of returning to the past, there is a limitation in that. It feels like sometimes she seems to be bound to this idea of aligning with old New York, of returning to tradition over and over again. And I think in her communications with Jouett and to Palmer through Jouett is kind of this sense of, I'm going to write an ultramodern novel. This is going to be something that is not old New York. Because there is no old New York to come back to at that point, where tradition lies, where the oldness lies is, she places it in the Hudson River Valley, which is, very much aligns with her childhood past. That's where her aunt, Elizabeth Jones, has the house Wincliffe. That's where she knows this architecture. She knows these aesthetics of the Hudson River Valley. So it's, I don't mean to denigrate the willows and say that it's a bad place, that it's, but I think through the willows, again, there is this kind of tension I think she presents between staying only there. And I do sometimes wonder about the end of the gods arrive, of Vance returning to Halo when she's pregnant. I'm not entirely convinced that's a happy ending. That it's, that it's going to work out well, because it's this space that's, he kind of becomes entrapped within at certain points. So I'm not entirely convinced the ending of The Gods Arrive is going to work out well for Halo and Vance. I could easily be persuaded otherwise, but, I've been thinking about that recently. What does this space mean at the end of The Gods Arrive? And I haven't really worked through that yet. I've been focused more on Hudson River bracketed. But I think it is a good point to make that, the willows is an integral part. I mean, that's the house that is manifested through this title that she's so adamant about keeping. So I completely
it's the
see your
American version of the past.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. For the purposes of our recording, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the conversation here. But if you guys do want to say more, you can totally do that after I hit stop on our recording. But before we sign off, I just wanted to thank everyone one more time. Thank you, the audience members and members of the Edith Wharton Society, for joining us. And thank you very much to our three presenters. And hopefully in the finished recording, we may be able to tack our fourth presenter on there as well. So if you are able to check that out, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much, guys.